Victoria Reynolds is with us again today. The subject matter today is shame. Victoria Reynolds is going to educate us about what shame is and how it works.
Well, shame to me is one of the most hurtful and harmful things we can do to each other as human beings. Everything that I teach is based on the idea that love and fear are polar opposites of each other. We have this misconception that hate is the opposite of love. In actuality, fear is the opposite of love, and hate is the lowest vibration of fear. We hate that which we fear, ultimately. All of these emotions that we feel and these energies that we feel as we move through life and the choices that we make as we move through life are either based in fear or based in love. And you can tell the difference between the two by the way they feel. So fear-based emotions, fear-based energies are those things that make us feel small, dark, repressed, and limiting, restricting. Those are fear-based emotions. And love-based emotions are those that make us feel light, that make us feel free, that make us feel open and generous. So when you can start to look at the emotions with which we move through life, we can start to consciously choose how to move through life. If we can choose to go through life based in love, or you can live by default and go through life based in fear. So we live in a fear-based reality. So when we're living life by default, we're living life by fear. When we consciously choose to live our lives on purpose, then we can choose to live our lives based in love. And shame is one of those fear-based emotions.
So shame is not based on love whatsoever.
Whatsoever. Shame is one of the lowest vibrations of fear. It literally keeps us stuck.
So shame's purpose is to
keep us small.
To control us then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a manipulative system.
Yeah, shame keeps us stuck in heavy, dark, limiting belief.
Counterproductive.
They just know they're bad.
Right.
So you have these issues, and I'm speaking from personal experience as well, as growing up with knowing I am a bad person. And at some point, something happens in a child that basically says, I'm tired of trying to be good, and everybody already thinks I'm bad, so I guess I'll just be bad.
Well, if they can't get any positive attention, no matter how hard they try, they might try something else.
Mm-hmm.
Why not?
Right.
Because having attention is more important than having no attention. So if a child can never get in your good graces and never know why, they're apt to get in your face or into trouble or something.
Yeah, because they require, like we have said before, human beings need validation that they exist. Every human being desires to be heard and to be seen. Because we're social animals. We need to be seen and heard by other human beings. And when we're not getting it through positive validation, we'll seek that however we can get it. Out of a call of desperation.
Then that's a call of desperation that leads our child to be victimized by their peers
Mm-hmm.
in the neighborhood, at school, trying to get attention.
Mm-hmm.
Any kind of attention, to be accepted no matter what. You stop and think about it for a minute. A lot of this acceptance of their peers is very destructive to that child. But yet they're willing to risk it if they think their friends will like them.
Yeah.
So you're setting your kid up for failure.
Precisely. Yeah. If a child is getting plenty of positive attention and reinforcement at home, they don't crave that as much from their peers because they feel good about who they are as a human being. You know, one of the lessons I've always taught my kids is that people are basically good. Good people make bad choices. That doesn't make them a bad person.
Right.
And a great thing about choices is that you could turn around and just make a new choice.
Well, the great thing about learning is to know that we make mistakes. That's a process of learning. Just because a person makes a mistake does not mean they are a mistake.
Correct.
We must draw the line between the individual and the error.
Right.
But when you shame a child, that internalizes it and they feel they are the error.
Correct. Yeah. They internalize all of that and they see themselves and own this belief that they are shameful.
Let's carry that further. What about the dual standard that shames women, specifically, one gender, for the same behavior that it praises men and pats them on the back for? What about that extreme dual standard of shame in our cultural society? What does that do, and where are we going with it?
Well, it keeps women small. It does. So as we, as women, try to lift ourselves up to the position of, I prefer to call balance rather than equality, because men and women are very different. We always will be. It's one of the interesting dichotomies of learning how to work together,
right,
and create a partnership between men and women, because we're radically different. We're complete and polar opposites. And when we learn how to work together, it's a beautiful thing. However, when one is worth less than the other one, instead of having this beautiful yin-yang partnership, we have over the misperception that one needs to always be above the other one, rather than being in this beautiful space of balance. So as long as we keep women held in shame, and we see that with being ashamed of our bodies, being ashamed of our minds, it's getting better. We don't get sliced up and hung up, on a rope anymore for having an opinion. We don't get our throat slit for saying something. We don't have that. And yet in the greater consciousness, there is still a fear, and there still is shame that comes with women speaking their truth, that comes with women sharing their healing gifts. It literally, that comes with women sharing what I refer to as your own medicine. So there is still a great deal of fear that comes, and shame that comes even with women sharing their innate gifts, because we've never been able to give them before. And then one of the areas that I really see shame is with sexuality. For example, women still get blamed for the reason they get raped, as if the girl did something to deserve being raped. She is still held responsible for a boy's behavior.
If she wears something that he finds seductive, it's her fault.
Correct.
And if
that's one of the underlying misperceptions.
And if she doesn't wear something that he finds seductive, she's not socially acceptable because she's not in style.
Right.
But if she does, she's sinful or evil.
And she should be ashamed of herself.
One of the things that I find kind of interesting is here, theoretically, is a little woman dressed seductively, and she has the great power to control a big, strong man and make him do something that is her fault. If she has that much power, why isn't she really using it?
And there are some women out there, unfortunately, who are trying to use that physical power, and they do use it to manipulate men. There are some women out there who do that, and it is personally, I find it's very hurtful to the entire culture of women, for women who are out there using their body to manipulate men. It's embarrassing. It's embarrassing for women, and men who have any dignity find it repulsive.
Well, if she really has enough power to control him, and I realize that she can seduce him.
She can seduce him. Ultimately, it's his decision.
Yes,
women are not in control of men's decisions.
Yes, that's the point. She can seduce him, but the decision is ultimately his.
Yes.
And I realize that she can deceive him, but the decision is ultimately his.
Correct.
The point that
we are not responsible for other people's behavior.
The point that I'm driving at, if she is responsible for his behavior, then why doesn't she make him a superstar and a great dad and wealthy and stuff, if she can actually control what happens to this man? I mean, this is not logical.
It's not. And when women do that, when women lean toward professions where they use their body, and I've had this discussion with men before and with women as well, and those of us who get it understand. When a woman takes on a role where they use their body to seduce men, it's because someone in their past has destroyed their sense of self and their body shame, because they were molested or raped or something as a child, and they no longer have that self-respect. They are in so much shame over their own body that they don't have any issues with using it.
So they've come to think that their value is as a sexual object.
Correct.
That's who they think they are.
Yeah.
And without being a sexual object, they have no value.
Yeah.
That's sad.
And I mean, think about a lot of the women that we grew up with, where we were raised with the belief that our worth is in our womb.
Right.
And how many girls I know who get out of that environment and the very first thing they do is get pregnant because it's the only thing they know what to do, or they become strippers, they become prostitutes, because their body is the only thing they know. They don't know that their value in any other way.
That's unfortunately very true.
Yeah.
And they are easily victimized because they've been taught blind obedience and don't say no.
Mm-hmm.
So then they are victimized and used and shamed
Mm-hmm.
when they knew no other way of life, because they were told if they didn't obey men, they would be damned, because
Right.
the man is the power of God. Really entrapping.
Very, very much so. And they're shamed into, every little mistake they make, they're shamed, and there's no way you can get past that shame. You have to live with that according to that particular belief system. And shame is an interesting thing, because it becomes, once you own it, it literally becomes a part of your physical reality. It entrenches itself so deep into your mind that it's really hard to break through, because it usually starts when you're really, really, really small. You're 2 years old and you start being shamed. It becomes almost a part of your essence until you start learning to recognize it.
Let's take that down a little further into the theology of what a good woman is. So many theologies teach that a good woman obeys her father, obeys her husband, is obedient. Mm-hmm. That's what a good woman is. A good woman doesn't make waves, doesn't say anything negative. So when you have these good, honestly good women that come out of cultures like you and I came out of, that are told if they are disobedient to the men, they will be damned.
Mm-hmm.
These good women are naive and they believe what the men tell them. And then they are victimized and shamed when their crime was believing
Mm-hmm.
somebody that wasn't believable. And I have seen that happen and experienced
Mm-hmm.
that coming out of that cult, when my crime was that I believed and had faith in someone who was only there to take advantage. And they don't know the difference because they've never been allowed to discriminate.
Right.
And then the shame belongs to them because they were a fool. But the shame should also belong, or totally belong, to the person that misled them.
However, how many of them don't even know that they did? See, shame is one of those things that's such an unconscious thing. It's part of the belief system. That believing that we're unworthy and that we need to be shameful, that we need to be ashamed of our choices, that we need to be ashamed of what we perceive as sin. I personally don't believe in sin. I think that's part of our belief systems. There are only mistakes, learning from those mistakes, and retakes.
Right.
But we have this belief that we need to be so ashamed of our mistakes that we carry that shame and that guilt through the rest of our lives. And that holds us in severe issues of worthlessness.
So there's never any differentiation between the person and the mistake. You make a mistake, thus you are a mistake.
Correct.
You were...
On a very subconscious level.
Yeah.
Yeah. So even as adults, we may have left that belief system years ago, and yet underlying are those little seeds of shame that were planted when we were children, until we start to really consciously look at those beliefs.
When we look at shame and manipulation, we also have to look at confidence games.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about women using men and manipulating them by seducing them because it could be done.
Mm-hmm.
We also have men that will manipulate and use women in confidence games by seducing their trust and taking advantage of them because it can be done.
Right.
And then the person who is victimized believes something is wrong with them because they didn't see it coming. And then they internalize that again as shame. Because they're told it's their fault. You were so stupid you deserved that.
Right.
How could you be so stupid? You let somebody take advantage of you when their crime was believing and trusting someone that had never earned the right to be trusted. So the concept that I'm bringing about here is the teaching that a good woman believes and trusts, and a good man believes and trusts.
Right.
And that sets them up for manipulation, because trust without validation leaves them wide open. And then they are shamed because allegedly it was their fault. How many con men blame the victims and say, well, they were so stupid, they deserved it. I'm smarter than they are. Now, isn't that applicable to the cult that we grew up in? Truly.
Very much so.
Isn't it applicable? Yeah. We were taught that was blind obedience and trust in faith in the men of the priesthood, no matter what they did. Does this not set a child, man or woman, up for victimization? And does it not set them up for shame and control to keep them in that victimization?
Yeah, and shame definitely holds people in that space. Absolutely. You know, from the time you're a small child and you don't do what you're told, but, you know, using God's name in vain, as I often say, that using God's name in vain isn't about saying the word God inappropriately. It's using God's name for men's vain purposes. And when that is the case, it sets children up from the time they're very small to be under that control. And it's shame just drives that down so deeply that, you know, as we've said before, the only way to get to God is through intense suffering, and shame just drives that suffering down into the core of who that child is.
I've seen both boys and girls coming out of the cults or staying in the cults that we grew up in that have been obedient, prayerful, dedicated, used, taken advantage of, suffered, and then blamed for their own suffering because it was their fault. Yes. It was their fault because they let it happen, therefore they deserved it. How do we help people get around that?
The main thing is understanding that we are not responsible for other people's behavior. We are not responsible for other people's choices. See, we're only responsible for our own behavior and our own choices.
And what about blind obedience? Deal with that choice. Help people deal with that choice. A good woman follows her husband. A good woman does what he says. A good woman puts him in charge. That's blind obedience.
It is. And that's just part of an old, archaic belief that people unfortunately still buy into, that some people unfortunately still buy into. It's a very archaic belief from thousands of years ago when women were owned by men. And we still, some of these belief systems, like the one you and I were raised with, still haven't gotten over the idea that women don't exist to be servants of men. We're not slaves anymore. We are not owned anymore. And yet, some of that belief still permeates in that particular belief system. That's what the obedience is, in the belief that men own us and they own our children. It's still about building the kingdoms of men.
And love, honor, and obey.
Well, most of us have taken that out of the vows. It doesn't exist in a lot of vows anymore.
I understand it, but it exists in a cultural thinking.
Just to some degrees and in some cultures, absolutely. And what's interesting is people are dumbfounded when I tell people where I came from, and some of the belief systems are dumbfounded that that belief still exists in this country. And yet it does exist to some degree even in our corporate environments where there's the boss and the secretary. where there's always the man over and the woman under. That is changing. As I've said, that evolution of belief takes time, and we are in this evolution of belief where now women are starting to rise up to the point where they're in balance with the masculine in various cultures. We're starting to see that in some companies that get it, and in some cultures here in America that get it. And it's, I mean, all over the world, there are some cultures, in the Middle East where women are so undervalued that they have honor killings. And, in the culture that we grew up with, it was that a woman can't get to heaven unless a man deems her worthy.
Right.
But
she has to put up with his polygamy and love it, or she can't get him to heaven so that he can deem her worthy.
Yeah, and supposedly that's a partnership. And yeah, so he could just get himself another woman, I guess.
Right.
Because this one didn't cut the bill.
Right.
Yeah, and then again, even as a woman, that shame is built into that particular belief system, because if a woman isn't the perfect woman, she's shamed into believing that the reason he can't get his other wives is because there's something she must be doing wrong. Well, my mom lived with that shame, that my dad only had my mother as his wife until high school. And the level of shame and guilt that she felt for the role she must have played, that he couldn't get another wife because there must be something she was doing wrong.
Well, I was told by my husband that I was immoral because I thought that he shouldn't have all these wives and women sexually, so I was immoral.
Right. You weren't allowing him to become the God he was born to be.
I was just plain immoral because he couldn't have multiple mates and sexual partners. So that's a pretty good projection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's an incredible, a very heavy load of BS.
Shame. And shame. He was shaming me.
He was shaming you because he couldn't have other women.
Well, because I wasn't delighted about it. I was evil and immoral. You got to be delighted about it, like on Sister Wives, whether you are or not, or you will be evil and immoral.
Right.
But his having multiple partners doesn't make him immoral. It makes me immoral if I don't like it.
Right. You know what, you're right. I remember when I was a kid, when my dad finally got his second wife, how proud and delighted my mom was on the outside. She took this woman around town and introduced her to everyone as her new sister wife. And then I would hear her crying at night in her bedroom.
Right.
But on all outward appearances, she was delighted to bring another woman into the family.
But the shame goes both ways for boys and girls in these cults. Mm-hmm. These boys are shamed if they don't dedicate their money and their time and their labor completely from the time they're a child, with no recourse or desire of their own, long hours to the leaders. They're shamed. Mm-hmm. They're shamed if their labor isn't used. They're shamed if their money isn't used by the leader of the church or prophet. They are shamed, and a lot of them having their families taken away from them and given to another man if they don't please the leader or the prophet. So the shame is induced in these children to victimize them, boys and girls, from the inception of their birth.
Yeah.
Now, it was extreme where we grew up, but the overall picture still flies alive and well across this nation. Men are degraded and work in dangerous jobs or do things that's against the conviction of their conscience to keep a job because they don't know how they're going to make a living or support their family if they don't. It's the same thing. Women put up with abuse and tolerate horrible things because they don't know how they're going to keep their children or support them if they don't. And it's the same thing. Mm-hmm. We need to address shame versus courage. Please speak on that.
Well, and it's shame versus confidence, and when your children are small, developing confidence in them rather than making them small when they make a mistake and shaming them for their mistakes, is sitting down and saying, what is the lesson we can learn from this? There's always a lesson to be learned in every perceived mistake. It's just learning lessons. And when you teach children how to extract the learning lesson out of their perceived mistake, it helps them develop confidence in their ability to step out and risk more and risk more and risk more, because they have the confidence to do that, knowing they can't fail, and that if they do fail, it's just another learning lesson. And that's where the courage comes in, because once you start building that, children are born as a clean slate. The only thing a child knows when they're born is love. Like for me, I look at a newborn baby and all I see is just a body of bliss.
Yes.
They learn fear. Love is the essence that they're made from.
Right.
So we come into this world a clean slate, and the only thing we know is we look up at that mother and what we feel is bliss. And then they learn fear, and we teach it to them. We can, in these very small lessons they start to learn as toddlers, we can teach them either, what did you learn from that? Or that probably wasn't a good idea, was it, honey? I told you not to play with that, and you did, and this is what happens. What do you think about not making that mistake again? You can actually have these kinds of conversations with a toddler, and they actually do get it. Most people don't realize just how smart kids really are. You can start to teach kids how actions and consequences work, and that can build up their confidence, and that can build up their courage to go out there and try new things. Or you take that exact same circumstance and beat them down with it, and then they have less and less and less self-confidence and less self-esteem and less self-worth, and don't have the courage to go out there and try those new things.
So you can teach them that every mistake they make is an opportunity for improvement.
Correct.
That it's a challenge, it's not a threat.
Yeah.
That it is simply a challenge to learn from. It is not a devaluation of character, ever.
Ever. Like my kids will say, well, that person's so good at that on TV. And I always remind them, do you really think they were the very first time they tried?
Right.
Nobody's good at anything the first time they try. The only difference is that they kept trying.
Right.
There's absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. You've never done anything wrong.
We just made mistakes and need to rise above them and realize
Learn
they
from
are
them.
an opportunity to learn. Hey, think how many light bulbs Thomas Edison made before he got one that could work.
Do you think he sat around and said, shame on me for my past? No. He said, I know there's a way to make this work, and I'm going to keep at it until I figure it out.
And he did.
And he did.
This is great. People need to understand it, that everybody makes mistakes, and if they don't, they're either a liar or too big of a coward to try anything.
That everybody makes mistakes, and there's nothing to be ashamed of.
Right.
And all of those people that tried to instill shame in you did it because they didn't know any better.
Yes, that's true. So forgive them their mistake.
For they know not what they did.
Exactly. And go on from there and grasp the truth, the reality, and the joy of your life.
Yes, and once you let go of the shame, and then you can start to see your true worth and your true value, then the whole world just opens up for you.
So drop the shame and embrace the potential.
Correct. That's beautiful. That's
great.
Precisely what it is.
Thank you, Victoria. So great to have you.
Thank you. Delighted to be here as always.